Everything with The Exorcist. It shocked them, let them have a moment. It's masterpiece filmmaking.
In 1973, a 14-year-old girl from Connecticut gave one of the most unforgettable performances in Hollywood history. The whole world knew her name overnight. But what came next, nobody saw coming. This is the story of The Exorcist and how one film destroyed Linda Blair's career. Part 12, Before the Demon. Linda Denise Blair was born on January 22, 1959, in St. Louis, Missouri. Her family relocated to Westport, Connecticut, when she was still a toddler, and from early on, Linda was the kind of kid who stood out in a room. She was bright, curious, and, more than anything else, she loved animals. Horses, especially. By the time she was in her early teens, she was competing in equestrian circuits and dreaming of a life that had very little to do with Hollywood. Her path to acting came almost sideways. Her mother, Eleanor, saw something in her daughter and helped get her started in modeling and commercial work in New York. By the time Linda was 11 or 12, she had appeared in television commercials and done some print work, but nothing that suggested a film career was around the corner. It was steady, practical, and modest. Linda was saving money. The plan was school, a normal life. She had already done small television appearances, a guest role in The Doctors, another in Hidden Faces, but none of it pointed toward stardom. She was, by her own later description, a regular kid who happened to have a job on the side. Then, in 1972, word got out that director William Friedkin was looking for a young girl to play the lead in a film adaptation of William Peter Blatty's novel about a child possessed by a demon. The casting search was enormous. Over 500 girls were considered. Friedkin had been through most of them and was growing discouraged. He needed someone who could be genuinely believable as both an innocent child and something horrifying, wearing a child's face. That combination was proving nearly impossible to find. Then Linda Blair walked in. Friedkin recalled the meeting vividly for years afterward. He said she was extraordinarily gifted and natural. A straight-A student, a champion horsewoman, with a presence that was impossible to manufacture. He cast her almost immediately. She was 13 years old when filming began. Part 11. The making of a horror classic. The production of The Exorcist was, by most accounts, a genuinely difficult experience. Friedkin was not known for gentle direction, and the environment on set was intense and often uncomfortable, especially for a young teenager who had never carried a major film before. The physical demands alone were extraordinary. During the famous levitation and possession sequences, Blair was strapped to a mechanically rigged bed, and the harness used during filming caused a fracture in her lower spine. She was in real pain during some of the scenes that audiences would later watch from the safety of their theater seats. There were also elements of the role that no amount of preparation could have readied her for. The makeup sessions were long and exhausting. The content of the scenes, the language, the imagery, the sheer darkness of what her character Reagan was made to do and say was unlike anything that had appeared in mainstream American cinema before. And Linda was doing all of this as a child, on a set full of adults, under the gaze of one of the most demanding directors in the business. What made it onto the screen, though, was remarkable. Her co-star Ellen Burstyn, a seasoned and highly respected actress, matched wits with Linda take for take. Film critic Mark Clark noted that Blair held her own with Burstyn completely, which, for a first major film role, was almost unheard of. The Exorcist was released in December 1973. The reaction was unlike anything Hollywood had seen before. People fainted in theaters. Some walked out. Others came back to see it again. Lines stretched around the block in every major American city. In New York, audiences waited for hours in freezing weather to get into a theater. It became a cultural event, terrifying, controversial, and impossible to ignore. It broke box office records and generated a storm of debate about whether it should exist at all. Churches organized boycotts. Columnists wrote that it was the most disturbing thing they had ever seen. Psychiatrists began receiving patients who said they had been traumatized by it. The film eventually earned over $441 million worldwide against a production budget of around $12 million, one of the most profitable films ever made at that point in Hollywood history. Linda Blair, 14 years old, was suddenly the most talked about actress in the world.
My friends were all getting ready for college. Like, my brain was somewhere else. And I said, I really don't want to do this anymore.
Part 10. The award and the crack in the ceiling. The recognition came quickly. Blair was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress and won the Golden Globe for the same category. She was the toast of Hollywood. Profiles appeared in every major magazine. The studio was thrilled. Her future looked limitless. But something happened in the weeks after the nomination that quietly altered the trajectory of everything. Word leaked that portions of her performance had been augmented. The terrifying deep voice of the demon, the voice that had crawled under the skin of everyone who heard it, had been dubbed by actress Mercedes McCambridge. Additionally, a stunt dummy had been used for a few seconds of the more physically extreme scenes. None of this was unusual for a production of that scale. It was standard filmmaking. But to the Academy, it apparently mattered. Blair was ultimately passed over for the Oscar, which went to Tatum O'Neal for Paper Moon. It was a blow, not a fatal one, but the kind that leaves a mark. And it arrived at exactly the wrong moment, when a young girl was still trying to make sense of the enormous, bewildering thing that had just happened to her life. Because while the awards world was sorting itself out, something else was already taking shape. People were beginning to look at Linda Blair not as a young actress with a future full of possibilities, but as one specific thing, the possessed girl from The Exorcist. Part 9, The Shadow that followed. Fame at that scale, at that age, is not something anyone is equipped to handle gracefully. Blair has spoken about it many times over the years, and what she describes is a kind of surreal siege. Everywhere she went, people recognized her, not with warmth, but often with fear, suspicion, or outright hostility. She told Fangoria magazine that people would see her in grocery stores or clothing shops and react with genuine alarm. Children would point. Adults would grab their kids and steer them away. Some people would make signs of the cross. Others wanted to touch her, as though proximity to her might confirm or dispel something they couldn't put into words. It was a strange kind of fame, not the admiring, glamorous version that most people imagine when they picture celebrity. It was more like notoriety, like being the person everyone has heard about, but nobody quite knows what to do with. Worse still, a segment of the public had decided that her participation in the film made her personally complicit in something sinful. Billy Graham, one of the most influential evangelical figures in America, publicly declared that the film carried the literal presence of evil. In his wake, Linda Blair, a teenager, began receiving hate mail and death threats from people who seemed unable to separate her from the character she had played. "I scared thousands of people," she told an interviewer, "and they would look at me. They would see me in a supermarket, in a clothing store, and their reaction was unbelievable." She was asked, almost every single day, whether she had suffered a breakdown while making the film. She had not. The questions kept coming anyway. She told one interviewer years later that it was an awful thing to go through as a teenager, who didn't fully understand the religious dimensions of the controversy she found herself standing at the center of. She was 14, then 15, then 16. The questions never stopped. Part 8. The roles that cemented the trap. Hollywood moved quickly to capitalize on Blair's name, but it did so in a way that would prove damaging in the long run. Rather than finding material that would demonstrate her range, the industry pointed her toward characters who were victims. Troubled, brutalized, endangered. Her first major post-Exorcist project was Born Innocent, a 1974 NBC television film in which she played a teenage girl who runs away from her abusive home and ends up brutalized in a girls' reform school. It was the highest-rated television movie of that year in the United States. It was also one of the most controversial broadcasts in the history of American network television. A shower scene depicting a violent assault caused such an uproar that the FCC used the controversy to pressure networks into establishing a family viewing hour policy. A lawsuit was even filed against NBC by a family in California who claimed the film had inspired a real-world assault on a child. Blair was 15 years old when she made it. The following year brought Sarah T., Portrait of a Teenage Alcoholic, 1975, in which she played a girl spiraling into addiction. Then Sweet Hostage, 1975, in which she played a kidnapping victim opposite Martin Sheen. Then Victory at Entebbe, 1976. She was barely old enough to drive, and she had already played a possessed child. a reform school victim, a teenage alcoholic, and a hostage. Critics began to notice the pattern. The Baltimore Sun wrote that Linda Blair had become a professional victim. The Philadelphia Inquirer called her an exhibitionist. The Los Angeles Times dryly imagined that Blair was probably asking herself who she had to know to get out of the business. These were not kind assessments, and they weren't entirely wrong about the situation she had been placed in, though they put the responsibility on her rather than on the industry that kept casting her this way.
There were not a lot of roles for women. It was difficult to find a project that you could put your heart behind.
Part 7. The sequel and the beginning of the end. In 1977, Blair returned to the role that had made her famous, Exorcist II. The Heretic, directed by John Boorman, reunited her with the character of Regan MacNeil. The production was chaotic and troubled. The critical reception, when the film was released, was disastrous. Despite earning $30.7 million at the box office, making it the most expensive film Warner Bros. Had produced at that point, it was widely considered a creative failure, a loud and hollow sequel to a film that had not needed one. That same year, the rest of Blair's personal life was unraveling. She had been living hard and fast since the age of 15. She had dated Rick Springfield, the Australian rock singer, when she was a teenager, a relationship her mother welcomed and approved of. After Springfield, she moved on to Glenn Hughes, the former bass player for Deep Purple, whose own lifestyle was equally turbulent. By 1977, she had developed a serious drinking problem. She has described it in plain terms, drinking enough vodka at night to be certain she would pass out. She was 18, and then came December 20th, 1977. Part 6. The Arrest. DEA agents and local law enforcement arrived at Linda Blair's home in Wilton, Connecticut, to serve a fugitive warrant that originated in Jacksonville, Florida. During the arrest, amphetamines were found on the premises. Blair was taken to the Court of Common Pleas in Stamford for arraignment. The background of the case had an almost absurd quality to it. Blair had traveled to Florida in October 1977 to attend the funeral of Ronnie Van Zant, the lead singer of Lynyrd Skynyrd, who had died in a plane crash. While in Florida, she had come into contact with individuals who were also selling pedigree puppies. According to accounts, she was primarily interested in one of the dogs and placed a hold on it. The DEA, who were monitoring the operation, recorded her phone calls with the dealers. Over time, she was pressured into a cocaine purchase alongside the puppy transaction. The conspiracy and possession charges were eventually reduced. Blair pleaded guilty to conspiracy to possess cocaine and received 3 years of probation, a $5,000 fine, and a requirement to make at least 12 public appearances warning young people about the dangers of drug use. She was 18 years old. The arrest dominated the headlines. Hollywood noticed. The phone calls slowed down. The blacklist, unofficial but unmistakable, had begun. Part 5. The descent into B-movies. In the years that followed, the landscape of Linda Blair's career shifted dramatically. The major studios largely moved on. What remained were the exploitation filmmakers, who were very happy to have a recognizable name attached to their low-budget productions, and who cared nothing about nurturing a career. Blair attempted to break out of the victim, typecasting at various points. She auditioned for the role of Emmeline in The Blue Lagoon, 1980, specifically to demonstrate that she could carry something romantic and aspirational. The role went to Brooke Shields. She had reportedly been considered for the role of Iris in Taxi Driver, 1976 as well, the part that ultimately went to Jodie Foster, earning Foster an Oscar nomination. The part she did get told a different story. In 1979, she starred in Roller Boogie, a film designed to ride the wave of the roller disco craze. It positioned her as a sex symbol, which was a deliberate attempt on her part to change how the industry saw her. But it didn't open the doors she had hoped for. Then came Hell Night, 1981, a slasher film, then Chained Heat, 1983, a women in prison movie, then Savage Streets, 1984, a rape revenge exploitation picture. In 1982, she posed for We magazine, an attempt to reframe her public image as a grown woman rather than a perpetual teenager. The nude photo shoot was meant to signal a transition. Instead, it reinforced the perception that her career had drifted far from the prestige world. TV Guide reviewed her performance in Savage Streets and called it her best since The Exorcist, and that's not saying much. During the period from 1980 to 1985, she received 5 Razzie Award nominations and won 2 of them. The Razzies, designed to mock the worst of Hollywood, had found a recurring target. Between 1983 and 1985 alone, she appeared in Chained Heat, Red Heat, and Night Force, 3 films in which she played women in peril in increasingly grim circumstances, for diminishing budgets and diminishing returns. These were not films that anyone at Warner Brothers or Universal was going to return her calls about. They were films made fast and cheap, designed for drive-ins and video rental shelves, and they were the only consistent work she could get. She was not unaware of what was happening. In interviews from this period, she comes across as someone who understood the trap she was in, but couldn't find the exit. She talked about wanting to do comedy, wanting to play someone who was not a victim, but the phone kept ringing with the same kinds of offers, and the other phone, the one she wanted to answer, stayed quiet.
The audience was so into it. They were just going nuts.
Part 4. Trying to stay afloat. It would be too simple to say that Linda Blair simply gave up or faded away. She kept working, kept showing up, kept trying to find something that would stick. In 1990, she appeared in Repossessed, a broad comedy parody of The Exorcist itself, a choice that reflected a hard-won ability to laugh at the thing that had defined and constrained her. She had cameos in Married, with Children, and guest appearances in series like MacGyver. In 1996, Wes Craven, who had directed her in the 1978 TV film Stranger in Our House, cast her in a small role in Scream. In 1997, she appeared in a Channel 4 documentary in the United Kingdom titled Didn't You Used to Be Satan? A biographical film that examined, with some honesty, the way The Exorcist had come to dominate her life and career. The title said everything. She was 38 years old, and the question people most wanted answered was still about a role she had played when she was 13. She starred in a Broadway revival of Grease that same year, playing Rizzo, a role that at least put her on a stage and reminded audiences that she could perform without a demon's face in the background. From 2001 to 2006, she hosted Scariest Places on Earth on Fox Family, a reality series that kept her visible on television, even if it kept her tethered, once again, to the horror genre. The A-list future that had seemed so certain in December 1973 never materialized. The trajectory that should have carried her from The Exorcist to major dramatic roles, the way it might have for another actress in different circumstances, simply never unfolded. The typecast had held. Part 3. What the industry did and didn't do. It is worth pausing here to consider the industry's role in what happened to Linda Blair, because the story is not simply one of personal missteps and bad luck. She was 13 years old when she was cast, 14 when the film was released. The studio was very willing to let a child absorb the full public controversy of one of the most inflammatory films ever made. When death threats arrived, they were her problem to manage. When reporters asked invasive questions about her mental health, she was expected to answer them. When the public conflated her with the character she had played, a possessed, demonically tortured child, she was given no real protection or guidance for how to navigate that. The roles she was offered afterward were, almost without exception, designed to exploit her association with victimhood, danger, and transgression. Born Innocent, Sarah T., Sweet Hostage. These were not thoughtful efforts to develop a young actress. They were calculated attempts to use her recognizability for roles that no well-managed career would have accepted one after the other. She was 15 when she moved in with a 25-year-old man. She was a teenager when her drinking problem began. She was 18 when she was arrested. At each of those moments, the Hollywood machine had already extracted what it needed from her and moved on. The blacklist after the drug arrest completed the picture. The same industry that had handed her the role and watched the storm without offering a weather shelter was quick to close its doors once she had become inconvenient.
The interview with Billy literally came up within 2 weeks. If it had been a month, 2 months later, it wouldn't have been me.
Part 2. A different kind of purpose. By the early 2000s, Linda Blair had found something that gave her life a clarity that Hollywood never had. She had loved animals since she was a small girl. As a child, the family home had included cats, dogs, rabbits, and even a skunk. As a teenager, horses had been her escape. In her adult years, that love had only deepened. She began rescue work, rehabilitation, and advocacy. And in 2004, she founded the Linda Blair World Heart Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to rescuing and rehabilitating abused and neglected animals. She later said that she had unknowingly left Hollywood, that she kept thinking she would find people who could take over her responsibilities at the foundation so she could return to acting. But she never found those people. And over time, the animals became the work, and the work became the life. In 2005, after the Hurricane Katrina disaster, Blair traveled to Louisiana to help rescue hundreds of dogs left behind. She had been lobbying for legislation against the slaughter of American horses for human consumption in Europe. She was spending her time not in screening rooms, but in shelters and rescue facilities that were, she said, overwhelmed and in a state of emergency. She went fully vegan. She described finding genuine peace and purpose in the work, something she had never quite located in the years of film sets and Razzie nominations and questions about The Exorcist. Part 1. The Legacy. In October 2023, Linda Blair made a cameo appearance in The Exorcist, Believer, the latest entry in the franchise that had launched her 50 years earlier. She reprised her role as Regan McNeil, now an adult, a brief but resonant appearance that brought a full-circle quality to a story that had spent 5 decades spinning without quite closing. Earlier in 2021, she had taken to social media to note that she had not been offered a role in the original plans for the new trilogy, a disclosure that generated real outrage among fans of the original film. The eventual cameo came later, after negotiations. In January 2025, Blair announced she was working on a memoir and had intentions to return to acting. She was 65 years old. She had been promising revelations about The Exorcist, about what really happened, about what it cost her. The numbers, when you lay them out, are striking. In 1973, she was one of the most celebrated actresses in Hollywood. By 1978, she was blacklisted. By the mid-1980s, she had collected 2 Razzie Awards. And yet she never entirely disappeared. She kept showing up, kept working in whatever space the industry allowed her, and eventually found a life outside it that gave her more satisfaction than the fame ever did. What The Exorcist gave her was real. The Golden Globe, the Oscar nomination, a place in film history that nobody can take away. Regan McNeil is one of the most iconic characters ever put on screen, and that performance, made by a 14-year-old girl working under extraordinary pressure, is still watched by millions of people more than 50 years later. But what the film cost her is also real. The years of being seen as only one thing. The roles that were designed to exploit rather than develop. The personal turbulence that came from being pushed into the spotlight far too young, without adequate protection or guidance. The career that should have been, the one that a different set of circumstances might have produced. It is not a straightforward tragedy. Blair herself would push back on that framing. She has spoken about the life she built with her foundation, the animals she has rescued, the causes she has fought for, with a pride and conviction that is entirely genuine. She did not end up broken. She ended up, in many ways, more herself than Hollywood would ever have allowed her to be. But the movie career, the one that seemed inevitable after December 1973, never became what it should have been. And the reason, more than anything else, is the one that has followed her every step since she was a teenager. The shadow of one film, one role, one demon. That is the story of The Exorcist, and how one film destroyed Linda Blair's career. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps more people find stories like this one. We'll see you in the next video.